There's a specific kind of person most of us have encountered at least once. Someone says something cutting to them in a meeting. A situation goes visibly wrong. Someone pushes, provokes, or tries to destabilize them, and they just stay. Not because they didn't hear it, not because they don't care, but because something in them doesn't move the way most people's does. They respond. They don't react. They engage. They don't escalate. They handle whatever is in front of them without the internal weather changing. And everyone in the room feels it. Most people assume this is a personality type, something you're either born with or you're not. The research says something more useful than that. Composure is not a temperament. It's a set of trainable psychological processes. And once you understand what those processes actually are, you can begin building them deliberately. In this video, we're going into the real psychology of composure, what's happening neurologically when someone loses it, why most anger management advice makes the problem worse, and what the research actually points toward for people who want to build something more permanent than just trying harder to stay calm. Let's get into it. Part 1. What's actually happening when you lose composure? Before you can build composure, you need an accurate picture of what's happening when it disappears. Most people describe losing composure as being overwhelmed by emotion, as if the emotion arrived from outside and simply overrode rational thought. Neuroscientist Joseph LeDoux's research on the amygdala provides a more precise account. The amygdala, two almond-shaped structures deep in the brain's temporal lobes, functions as a threat detection system. When it identifies something as threatening, it triggers a cascade of physiological responses before the prefrontal cortex. The region responsible for rational thought, context, and consequence has had time to process what's actually happening. LeDoux called this the low road, a fast, automatic pathway from sensory input directly to emotional response, bypassing the slower, more deliberate processing of the thinking brain. This is why you can find yourself already angry, already defensive, already reactive before you've consciously decided to be. The response precedes the decision. But here's what's important about LeDoux's research for the purposes of building composure. The amygdala doesn't respond to reality. It responds to perceived threat. And perceived threat is significantly more trainable than most people assume. What triggers the amygdala response, what the brain reads as threatening, is not fixed. It's built through experience, interpretation, and belief. Which means composure isn't about suppressing the response once it's already firing. It's about changing what the brain reads as threatening in the first place. Part 2. Why trying to stay calm makes it worse. This is the part most composure advice gets wrong. The standard recommendation is some version of control yourself, count to 10, breathe deeply, suppress the response until the moment passes. Stanford psychologist James Kross spent decades studying emotion regulation strategies and documented something that should change how we think about this. Suppression, the active effort to control the outward expression of an emotional response, doesn't reduce the internal experience. It increases it. When people use suppression as their primary regulation strategy, their physiological arousal during stressful situations is higher than people who don't suppress, not lower. The internal experience intensifies precisely because the energy of the response has nowhere to go. And the cognitive cost of maintaining that suppression, of holding the reaction in while continuing to function, depletes the same finite resource that clear thinking, good judgment, and composed behavior all draw from. Which is why people who stay calm through sheer force of will in one situation often find their composure collapsing at the next one, or at something much smaller. They haven't built composure, they've borrowed against it. The alternative Gross's research points toward is what he called cognitive reappraisal, changing the interpretation of the situation rather than suppressing the response to it. Not, I'm angry, but I won't show it, but let me see what's actually happening here before I decide how to respond. The distinction sounds subtle. The neurological difference is significant. Cognitive reappraisal, used consistently, reduces amygdala activation before the response fires, rather than trying to manage the response after it already has. Part 3. The 3 misreads that destroy composure. Most anger and reactivity is not actually about the situation in front of you. It's about what the situation means. Research on cognitive appraisal theory, developed by psychologist Richard Lazarus and colleagues across decades of stress research, shows that the emotional response to any event is mediated almost entirely by the interpretation of that event. The same situation produces different emotional responses in different people, not because different things are happening to them, but because they're reading what's happening differently. Composure in this framework is largely a function of interpretation. And there are 3 specific misreads that research consistently shows are responsible for the majority of composure failures. The first misread is personalizing what isn't personal. When someone is dismissive, aggressive, or difficult, the reactive brain reads it as being about you, as a statement about your worth, your competence, your right to be in the room. The composed response requires a different read. Most difficult behavior from other people is a statement about their internal state, not a verdict about yours. Research on attribution theory shows that people who maintain composure under provocation are significantly more likely to make situational attributions for other people's negative behavior, to read it as a product of circumstance, stress, or their own struggles, rather than dispositional attributions that make it about the character of the person in front of them. This isn't generosity, it's accuracy. Most provocative behavior is, in fact, situational. The second misread is treating impermanence as catastrophe. Psychologist Albert Ellis identified this pattern in his rational emotive behavior therapy framework, the tendency to read temporary, fixable situations as permanent, irreversible disasters. The project falls behind. The conversation goes badly. The plan doesn't hold. The reactive response treats each of these as evidence of something final, as proof that the situation is fundamentally broken and that nothing can be done. The composed response holds a different frame. Most setbacks are temporary, and most problems have a response available. Ellis called the catastrophizing interpretation one of the primary drivers of emotional dysregulation, and documented that changing the interpretation changes the emotional response more reliably than any other intervention. The third misread is confusing comfort with control. A significant amount of reactive behavior is not actually a response to what's happening. It's a response to the discomfort of not being in control of what's happening. The situation feels unpredictable. The outcome feels uncertain. The other person's behavior feels beyond influence. And the reactive brain reads that discomfort as a threat, requiring an immediate response. Research by psychologist Roy Baumeister on the relationship between perceived control and emotional regulation consistently shows that people who maintain a wider tolerance for uncertainty and unpredictability show significantly more composure under pressure than people who require control to stay regulated. Composure, in this frame, is partly a function of how much unpredictability you can hold without reading it as threatening. Part 4. What the composed brain is actually doing. This is where the research moves from diagnosis to instruction. Because once you understand what composure actually is neurologically, you can begin to understand what builds it. The composed person isn't suppressing their response. They're operating from a different set of automatic appraisals. Psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett's research on the construction of emotion offers one of the most useful frameworks here. Barrett's theory, developed across decades of neuroscience research, argues that emotions are not automatic readouts of external reality. They're constructed by the brain using 3 inputs simultaneously: current sensory information from the body and environment, predictions built from past experience, and the conceptual categories the brain has available to make sense of what's happening. What this means practically is significant. The emotion you experience in a given situation is not a fixed response to that situation. It's a prediction, the brain's best guess about what's happening and what it means, built from the patterns it has accumulated over time, which means the patterns can be changed. The composed person in Barrett's framework has built, through experience, attention, and practice, a different set of predictions about what threatening situations mean and what they require, not through suppression, through reconditioning. Part 5. 4 practices that build composure on purpose. The research points toward 4 specific practices that change the underlying prediction system rather than just managing the output. The first practice is what psychologist Marc Brackett at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence calls expanding your emotional granularity. Brackett's research shows that people who have a larger and more precise emotional vocabulary, who can distinguish between frustrated and disappointed, between anxious and uncertain, between angry and hurt, show significantly more emotional regulation than people who operate with coarser categories. The reason is neurological. Naming an emotion with precision activates the prefrontal cortex and reduces amygdala activity, a process neuroscientists call affect labeling, first documented by Matthew Lieberman and colleagues at UCLA. You don't have to process it, you don't have to resolve it, just naming it precisely. Not, I'm angry, but I'm embarrassed and I'm reading that as a threat, changes the neurological response. The second practice is building what psychologist Angela Duckworth calls distress tolerance, the capacity to stay present and functional in conditions of discomfort, uncertainty, or provocation without requiring the discomfort to resolve. Duckworth's research on grit and self-regulation consistently shows that the most composed individuals under high-pressure conditions are not the ones who experience less discomfort. They're the ones who have built a wider tolerance for the experience of discomfort itself. This is trained, not inherited, and it's trained through deliberate, repeated exposure to discomfort in contexts where you have time to practice staying present rather than reacting, progressively expanding the tolerance through the same mechanism that builds any physical capacity. The third practice draws on research by psychologist Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan on what he calls self-distancing. Kross's research shows that people who adopt a third-person perspective on their own emotional experience, who ask not, why am I so angry, but why is this person so angry right now, show significantly reduced emotional reactivity and significantly faster recovery from provocation. The mechanism is the same one that makes it easier to give advice to a friend than to yourself. Distance reduces the intensity of appraisal. Practically, this looks like a simple shift in the language you use when processing a difficult situation, from first-person immersion to third-person observation. The distance isn't avoidance, it's perspective. And perspective is what the reactive brain loses first. The fourth practice is building what the research calls a response library, a set of predetermined practice responses to the situations that most reliably destroy your composure. Research on implementation intentions, developed by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer, shows that people who have decided in advance exactly what they will do in a specific difficult situation are significantly more likely to follow through on that decision under emotional pressure than people who intend to handle it well without having specified how. The reactive brain operates fast. Preloaded responses operate faster. If you have already decided, when someone dismisses me in a meeting, I will pause, breathe once, and ask a clarifying question. That decision is available before the amygdala response has had time to override it. Part 6. What composure actually looks like from the inside. Here's what most people get wrong about what it feels like to be composed. They imagine it as the absence of feeling, as if the composed person is somehow not affected, is processing the provocation from behind glass, untouched by what's happening. The research describes something completely different. The composed person feels what's happening, Often, as research on emotional intensity and intelligence suggests, they feel it more acutely than most. What's different is not the presence of the response. It's the relationship to the response. Psychologist Stephen Hayes, whose work on acceptance and commitment therapy has produced some of the most robust research on psychological flexibility in the literature, describes the key distinction as diffusion, the ability to observe a thought or feeling without fusing with it. Not, I am angry, but I notice I'm experiencing anger right now. That single shift in framing, from identification with the emotion to observation of the emotion, changes what the emotion can do. It can be present without being in charge. It can be felt without determining the response. Hayes' research across hundreds of studies shows that psychological flexibility, the ability to hold difficult internal experiences without letting them dictate behavior, is one of the strongest predictors of sustained composure under chronic stress, provocation, and difficulty. Not because it makes the difficulty smaller, because it changes the person's relationship to difficulty itself. Part 7. The long game. Everything in this video points towards something that most composure advice skips over because it isn't convenient. Composure is not a skill you build in a difficult moment. It's a quality you build in the moments before the difficult ones. The expanded emotional vocabulary practiced in ordinary conversations. The distress tolerance trained in small, manageable discomforts. The self-distancing applied to minor frustrations before the major ones arrive. The response library built in calm moments so it's available in reactive ones. Viktor Frankl, whose observations on human behavior under the most extreme conditions imaginable remain among the most cited in the psychology of resilience, wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies a person's freedom and their power to choose their response. Building composure is building that space, not through suppression, not through indifference, not through trying harder to stay calm in the moment when calm is hardest to find. Through training the system, the appraisals, the interpretations, the predictions, so that the space is already there before you need it. The person in the room who doesn't move when everyone else does, who responds when others react, who stays when others escalate, is not someone who feels less. They're someone who built something most people never thought to build. Not because they were born differently, because they understood what composure actually is and worked on the right thing. Which of the 3 misreads has been costing you the most? Personalizing what isn't personal, treating impermanence as catastrophe, or confusing comfort with control? Drop a number in the comments. And if you want to understand the deeper psychology of why certain situations trigger you when similar ones don't, watch this next. The psychology of emotional triggers, why you react the way you do. Because composure starts with understanding what your system is actually responding to. See you there.